I lovingly call them the breakup fee at closing.
That's a good term. I didn't. I'm going to use that.
But because she was unhappy with the speed of the wire, she showed up here screaming and hollering, beating on the door, yelling at everyone. I mean, she was like unhinged. It was terrible. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Real Estate Show. I'm Tiffany Weber, and today I am joined by Megan Anderson, real estate attorney extraordinaire, adventure mom to the max. And we are going to go through the North Carolina offer to purchase from a seller's perspective, like the key things that a seller or a listing agent should be aware of that they may not be thinking about that much. You cool with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say, obviously, every party needs to read the whole contract. But the things to start with, let's go to page 3 of the offer to purchase, 1M, closing. I think one thing that listing agents could impress upon their sellers is when they're actually going to get paid. Megan, when are the sellers actually going to get paid?
So sellers get paid when we disperse our funds. And this is probably one of the last check boxes of a whole closing transaction. Mm-hmm. So everybody has to sign all of the documents. We have to have all of the buyer's money, either through their lender or through their, through their deposit. And then we have to take it to the county to record. The county has to stamp it, date it. We have to receive it back from the county or have notice that it's been recorded, time-stamped. Mm-hmm. And then once we get all that back and everything is good on our end, then we will start to process those funds. Mm-hmm. And the seller can either come pick up their check, we mail it to them if they're not in state, or we can just send it a wire through if we have their bank information.
Yeah. And the disbursement, let's see, all of this is not instant. I guess what I'm trying to say here is it says the recording should happen as soon as reasonably possible for the attorney after the title update, after all the funds are in, after all the documents have been signed. So there's not even an obligation for immediate recording. So this is taking into account, when it's possible for the attorney to record in a reasonable time frame. Of course, we want to do it as quickly as possible because we don't like getting the calls of where's my money, when can I have the key? We want this to move along. We have no incentive to drag it out. Right. But I think there can be a misconception from sellers that maybe, I signed the deed, just go stamp it and give me my money.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff that has to happen in between. And then also the disbursement itself is not instant either. There's a lot of checks to be written.
We do not give checks out at the table.
Nope. They're like I went to another closing and the attorney gave it to me before recording. Well, maybe that attorney is comfortable with breaking the law, but we're not.
Right. It's a law. It's not just our preference.
Yeah, it is. If that attorney was giving away money at the closing table, then it was the attorney's own money. Because if that didn't record and they gave you money, then. But yeah, so I think because of how often we get the question, we know that there could be more communication before the closing about this process.
Yes.
And more explanation to a seller, because they'll be like, well, I'll just sit. I can wait in the lobby. I've got 15 minutes. If you could just run it out before I have to go. We're like, no.
I did have one the other day. They were going to go to Costco and then come back. After their Costco trip, I said, well, how long does it take you at Costco?
Yeah, you got a long Costco trip.
Because it's going to be at least, 3-4 hours minimum before we can.
And they're probably just running to grab some bread,
Pick up some more chicken nuggets.
Yeah, I hope they were buying TVs, school supply. They needed
the
literally a
cart
half day
experience. Yeah.
And then when it comes to sending a wire too, we can't send a wire until we verified the wire instructions. So if you're not available for us to verify wire instructions, then we're not sending a wire without doing that.
Right. Until we talk to you or you verified them, we don't process anything out except
I'll probably have a nightmare about that. tonight. I shouldn't have brought it up.
But people just calm down.
I know. Now, the next thing, fixtures and exclusions. I think this one's really important because there's a whole long list of the things that are part of the house. You might not think they're part of the house, but they are. Like TV mounts. If it's attached, then...
To the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like a basketball goal that's permanently attached or in ground. Like there's all kinds of examples here, but these are things that have to stay with the house, and sellers will take them. And this happens all the time. So I would call attention.
Yes. I've had so many buyers come in and say, you know, the light bulbs are missing. The TVs that were supposed to stay that were attached, they are missing. You know, the decor that, you know, planters outside that have been growing plants, those are missing.
Oh, they took
trees are missing.
The Nest thermostat. When we went under contract, it was a Nest thermostat, and they took it out and put in a regular one. No, you can't.
Yeah.
You can't do that unless it's agreed upon in writing.
Right, you have to agree to it. Like currently right now we have one water heater, but we have saved the prior water heater because we purchased a new one, and if we move any time, we want to take that new one. The other one still works.
And you can do that before you list it.
But we would disclose it, or, you know, we'd
Yeah.
already switch them out before we go under contract.
Yeah, and if you don't, then you're just out of luck.
Yes.
Yeah, people will think, well, I put in the Ring doorbell and I want to take that, so I'll just put in a regular doorbell. If you showed it with the Ring doorbell and you went under contract with the Ring doorbell and didn't exclude that, and you have the option to do that later in the contract, Section E, other items that do not convey. Identify items to be excluded under paragraphs A and B. So you can say, I'm taking the Ring doorbell and I'll just put the regular one back on. But if you don't do that, you got to leave the Ring doorbell. And this is another one of those things that it might seem obvious, especially since there's so much real estate dedicated to this within the contract and there's specific stuff laid out, but it happens constantly. Like pull-up bars, you know, like we have a home gym and have for a very long time, and we've got stuff that's attached. And we've had to leave it, you know, like we know that we have to be incredibly careful that if we don't want to leave that mounted pull-up bar, we remove it before we put the house on the market. Yes. Otherwise, we're stuck leaving it there. So, yeah, I thought that was a big one.
I had a little old lady seller. She, before she, like, I guess people would come and look with their agents, the buyers, she put sticky notes on things that she knew that were not going to stay with the house. This is not staying. This is not staying. But I just thought, I mean, maybe that was a good idea on her part, because she didn't understand the whole process, but she understood that those are things she wanted to take with her or not. Yeah. So she was labeling her possessions. I had a little bit of respect for that, I think, because then you don't even have to negotiate it on the offer to purchase. Right. You know, if you don't want to make an offer because you know I'm not leaving you the fridge. Right. Okay, move on. But for her to think of that, something must have happened prior to that for her to have gone through that. Had to. That's usually how it's happened. That's why this contract is so long. Stuff like that happens. All the things. They have to keep adding to it. Now, I think the next thing that I would want to talk about specific to sellers is the buyer's right to terminate. This is on page 6, 3G. I have had agents say, well, doesn't the buyer have to buy it? No. I think most seasoned agents know that, but I've had even very experienced agents on the listing side, be right close to closing, and a buyer is wanting to terminate. And they're not asking for anything back. They know they've given up their due diligence and their earnest money 2 days before closing, but they're like, oh, but don't they have to buy it? No. I've had the same thing. We talked about it previously. The buyer was going to put an addition onto the house, but because of county guidelines, setbacks, requirements, they didn't realize that they wouldn't be able to do that. And one of the agents was saying that, the buyers have to proceed with the purchase. And I said, well, no one's going to make them buy the house. They're going to lose their deposits. But that's the seller's compensation for the termination.
Yeah.
No, you're not going to be able to go to court, and no judge is going to make the buyer perform the purchase because there's already, that's why you have the contract, and that's why you have your deposits down, because that's your compensation if things fall through.
Yeah. And some people think that's unfair that a seller can be forced to perform, but a buyer can't. But I'm sure there's some analysis of this somewhere, but the reason the seller can be charged with specific performance is because property is not a fungible good. It's a specific thing, and if you're buying a specific piece of property, there's not a replacement for that specific piece of property. There's nothing else like that. There's only that piece of square on the earth. It's not interchangeable with one, in a different state or whatever. You're buying it because that's the thing that you want. Whereas what you're receiving from a buyer is money, and money is a fungible good.
Right.
So, you get your liquidated damages, and you go get a different buyer who's also going to give you money.
Right.
So it's not as it'd be different if it was like trading properties.
Yeah.
Like if rather than exchanging money or exchanging property, then there would be a completely different contract. You're not going to be able to use this one. And you could have specific performance for each. But no, buyer doesn't have to buy. Now, depending on when they terminate, they might be giving up more money than they would otherwise.
Right.
But they can back out. We've had, within the last couple months, we've had a buyer not show up to closing, and that's how the sellers found out they were terminating. And it was a big old group of sellers. Do you remember that? The group of heirs? Erica was doing the closing. Yeah, there was.
I didn't know the buyer did not. I thought the buyer was just going to sign at a different time.
Nope. They were like, "Where's the buyer?" And we're like, "Oh, why?" Kind of like, "Why are you guys here?"
Oh.
So we got to break the news. Not the most fun. I'm saying it like I didn't even have to do it. It was Erica was doing the closing, so I did not envy her. But they were like, "What? What do you mean?"
Yeah, that's a tough conversation to have, especially when you're thinking that you're going to be done with this headache, because I'm sure that they had taken a lot to get there if there was lots of heirs to an estate.
Oh, yeah. Pro tip, if you're terminating, tell the seller.
Courtesy.
Maybe tell the seller that if you've terminated, tell the seller, because otherwise you haven't terminated until they know. Now, the next thing that I think is important for sellers, but maybe they don't realize, and this is most likely if you're listening to this, you're an agent or you're somebody that works with an agent. But I see this a lot with unrepresented sellers where they haven't filled out their owner's association disclosure statement or the mineral and oil and gas. So there's a space in here to check whether the buyer has received a copy of those disclosures or not, and it's on page 7. And if they have, which usually they get before they make the offer, but if they have not, then the buyer is going to have the option to terminate or withdraw without any sort of penalty. So typically, as soon as this contract's been signed, it's effective, and the due diligence is non-refundable, unless they weren't provided a signed copy of these disclosures. So that gives them a short little window of, even if the contract's been signed, they haven't been given these disclosures, they can terminate. So I like to point that out, especially when it's like an unrepresented party, because they might not have all the paperwork filled out that they need to. And that's another example of why having an agent who does this for a living and who knows this is going to help you through a transaction, because you might skip steps that are integral to having a binding contract.
Required. Yeah, that is a loophole. If you don't provide them with all the forms that are required, then they can terminate.
Now, let's move on to seller representations, specifically the owners' associations and dues. Talk to me about what happens if you don't tell a buyer about an HOA, or if you, some have like HOA dues and then like boat slip dues, and you don't disclose one of them.
If you don't disclose, that might be a material fact that you are not presenting to the buyer. And if they don't know about it, they're going to have an issue with paying for that, extra fee annually, because it's not just going to be a one and done at closing. They're going to have to continue to fork up that money to the HOA. But that is a material breach of non-disclosure, which you are required to disclose because it's attached to the property where the property is located. The HOA is essentially another third party that can put a lien on that property, and the buyer needs to have, all those facts accounted for going into the settlement.
Yeah. And then also, if there's any assessments, what we see more often, I think, is the dues were disclosed, but there's some ongoing special assessment that the seller doesn't tell. And unfortunately, sometimes it's intentional, because the contract is going to have, any assessments that have been levied, the seller's going to have to pay any special assessments.
Yes.
That are like, if they're proposed, then you got to tell so that the buyer can decide if they want to take the property subject to that.
Right.
So sometimes we'll see sellers, unfortunately, intentionally not tell about those things. And then when we get the HOA estoppel and find out about it, they're like, I'm not paying that. I never said I would pay that. Well, contract says you have to, or, your failure to disclose it, the buyer might, you're lucky the buyer wants to buy it instead of saying that you breached. So, just tell it.
There's always a paper trail. The HOAs keep trails. We had one, it's been several months, but there was a special assessment, and they had already it was voted in. I think the total amount was $1,600. And at the table, the seller was telling me that they did not know about this assessment. They had no idea. And they were very upset that they were being charged the fee, but it was only half of the fee because they had already paid the first half of the fee. They had split it. The HOA had split the fee in half because it was such a large amount. They were giving the property owners a break. And so they'd already paid the first half in the beginning of the year. And then, so they were supposed to pay the other half at the end of the year or the beginning of the next year. So I said, you may have forgotten, or you didn't realize you paid this special assessment, but you were provided notice.
Yeah. And the check has cleared your account for the thing that you didn't know about.
Right.
So if you didn't know about it, then you probably should keep a closer watch on your bank account if it's auto drafted and figure out why you're getting charged $800.
Right. And that might have been the case, because she seemed very confused, but then she was very quiet at the end.
Because you got her.
Yeah.
Lawyered. Boom. Now, in paragraph 8, seller obligations. These are some things that we encounter this more so before we get to the table, but the 8A, this is stuff that the seller has to provide to the closing attorney or to other necessary parties. So some things that sellers may not realize, that if they've got it in possession or it's available to them, so it doesn't have to be, right handy, but it's available for them to get, then they are supposed to use their best efforts, which has a meaning under the common law, which is something beyond I'll get to it if I can.
Right.
It means I got to try to get this. Copies of all title information. So this would include title policies, title opinions from other attorneys, surveys, restrictive covenants, deeds, notes and deeds of trust, leases, and easements. So part of the title search, the attorney is going to go looking for all of this stuff anyway. But the survey one is super interesting, because sellers are like, that's my survey. I paid for it. I'm not giving it to the buyer. Well, you should have altered the contract. You're giving it to the title attorney, and it's going to become part of the buyer's file. So they're going to have access to it. It may not mean that you're sending it directly to the buyer, but you agree by the standard offer to purchase to provide to the closing attorney surveys.
Right.
And again, it doesn't have to be sitting in your desk drawer. It just has to be available to you. And available would mean sending an email to your surveyor and saying, hey, I can't find a copy of my survey.
Right.
Will you email it?
You know of its existence. You have to try to track it down if you don't have that copy.
And there will be sellers who are like, well, I'll give it up if the buyer will pay me $500 or whatever. And we have to point to this. And they're like, well, that says to the closing attorney. Yeah, to the closing attorney. So they want to negotiate. Well, we have to make sure that the buyer never sees it. And like, well, we represent the buyer. You know, like it becomes like this whole circular thing. And eventually they either do give it or the buyer says, whatever, I want an updated survey anyway. Like, you know, don't worry about it.
But what are they going to do with the survey that they don't own property to anymore?
Great question. But there's some sellers that dig in there. They don't feel like they should be required to provide anything. And they are, and they should. And then also like timely providing stuff about your payoff. So this is all information needed to obtain a written payoff statement. So yes, you do have to give us your account numbers for every loan you have on the that's secured by a deed of trust on the house.
Yes.
Like sellers will try to get sneaky and only give their primary and think the equity line's going to sneak by.
Right.
Like, or no, you got to give all that.
Or they think because the equity line is zeroed out that we don't need that information. Mm-hmm. No, we have to.
If it hasn't been satisfied.
We have to record a satisfaction, which the bank has to sign off on. So yes, we need that information.
So, and then that also includes signing the authorization to get the payoff statement. So we need the account information, but then we also need the written authorization. So if you're, you got a seller that's like, well, I'm not giving that up. You are required to give it up.
Right.
And then beyond that, providing the non-foreign status certification, which also includes the Social Security number, we'll have sellers that will try to, they'll either provide us incorrect or refuse to provide their social. That is, they can be fined by the U.S. government for not providing that when it's requested.
Yep.
So not only is it required by the IRS, but the contract says that you're going to give that in a timely manner, or that if you're refusing to do that, then we have to treat you as if you're a foreign person and we have to withhold the 15% and pay it to the IRS. I promise.
You don't want that.
You would much rather give the non-foreign cert. The next thing, we talked about this on the buyer's side too, but this is incredibly important for sellers, access to property. How long does the seller have to give the buyer access to the property while they're under contract?
So reasonable, but till you close, until the buyer takes possession. If the buyer can come, hopefully they are scheduled. Hopefully you can agree that, at this time, this date, you can come and look, do what you need to do, get it all taken care of, or, for inspections, let them in if they have to come back, or if they're having a survey done on the property, make sure they have access to the whole entire property. That usually comes into play with like bigger farm properties, things like that. But I mean, reasonably, if, the buyer can't come every day and be there all day long to plan their new move in, but at least here and there, if the buyer needs to, for purchasing the property, things that they are trying to get done, either for due diligence or just as a move-in piece of the move-in process. But it's up until you close.
Yeah, it's not just that due diligence period. Some sellers will think, well, your due diligence is up. You're out of luck. I'll see you at the walkthrough.
Right.
That's it. Well, no, they can keep conducting due diligence the whole time. The period is tied to if they lose their earnest money or not.
Right.
And you can't, the reasonable access is, that comes to play with not just the buyer, but their agents or representatives.
Yes.
So that means you can't unreasonably say, no, your inspector can't come on the property. because that is an agent of the buyer. That's a representative of the buyer performing due diligence. And we've heard the nightmares of sellers, pulling the shotguns out at the inspector or the surveyor saying, get off my property, while they're under contract to sell it to the person they're doing the work for.
Right.
So that is a no-no.
Yes. I've had a couple sellers refuse access to, surveyors or inspectors because the buyer is not there with them presently. But, buyers can't always work at the same schedule, and they are paying for those services.
Yeah, it's not a condition that the buyer has to be there.
Right. That's not.
It says including but not limited to allowing buyer and or buyer's agents or representatives. So that could, if a buyer's agent is not even meaning real estate agent, it could be their attorney in fact. They could designate their father as their representative.
I do believe it is the buyer's due diligence to let the seller know who is coming by, when they're coming by, what they're going to be there for, obviously, so the seller's not taken off guard. Yeah,
completely agree with that. But on the other side of that, of course, provided it's reasonable, not 2 a.m. Just because you don't like people poking around, well, then don't put your house on the market to sell it.
Your property is for sale. People are going to want to look at what they're purchasing.
So that also includes the seller having to keep the utilities operating at their cost. So you cannot shut off the utilities. And if you do, you're, and as long as you haven't done so mistakenly, if you intentionally shut off the utilities and you're like, screw it, not my problem anymore, you're going to be in breach.
Right.
The buyer doesn't have to close if they can't verify these things and conduct their due diligence. We had a person contact us that they weren't closing nearby, so they were closing at a different attorney's office a couple hours away, and the agent was one that we work with, and she's like, "What do we do? They won't turn on the utilities." I'm like, well, they're in breach of contract. And they said we're not turning them on. I'm like, well, they have to.
Right, you have to
under the contract, unless they want to just fight it. I mean, unless they're intending to breach and they want to fight about it in court,
they want to be done. Yeah,
but yeah, the contract's pretty clear. The language is not difficult to understand. It includes providing existing utilities. Well, you talked to me a little bit about this removal of seller's property, which is the next paragraph. That the seller has to remove all personal property and garbage and debris by the time possession's made to buyer. What have you seen where that has not quite gone the way it should?
Well, I have recently done an addendum to a contract that both parties were in agreement that the seller could keep certain things on the property, but that's going to be an outside addendum and included with your contract. And usually it's going to be an attorney drafted document because it's not a standard form. But also, the buyers do that final walkthrough and, they come to closing and say, sellers, trash bags are here. They haven't fully moved all of their stuff out. Do we get their furniture? Do we have to take care of their trash? And, that is a red flag because one, not necessarily do you get to keep those things. Sellers should have already taken care of them or let communication is key. Let you know that, hey, we got backed up or the moving people could not finish loading all the stuff one day. They have to come back the next day. And those things can be at least agreed upon, not just a surprise when you walk through the house and there's still all this stuff there. But then you have those sellers who just, I guess, don't care.
Or they say, oh, I feel like the buyer would like to use this.
Right.
We don't really have room for it on our moving truck. It's a nice desk. Like,
we'll just leave it.
Yeah, it's nice. The buyer should be happy we're leaving it.
Or they can just sell it.
Yeah. They just, well, it must not be that nice if you don't want to take it yourself.
Right. At that point, yes, it is part of the contract. So they are, if the buyer in that case does not want it, some buyers are like, yeah, I'll take it. And that's fine. But if the buyers don't want the headache or they don't think it's as nice as the sellers, then it is the seller's responsibility to come back and take care of that.
I don't know how many times I've been at the closing table where a buyer said, what were you going to do about those, some piece of furniture they've left there, or whatever it may be? And the sellers say, oh, we left that for you. We thought you would like it. And the buyer is then put in a really uncomfortable position because they don't want to insult the seller, but they clearly don't like it. And also, it's not their problem. It's the seller's obligation to have taken it out. So this, I think we could benefit from some more education to sellers on, hey, you got to take your stuff out.
Right.
Don't just leave stuff hoping that the buyer will like it, because what you're really doing is just making it their problem.
Right.
You're making your move their problem. And by the contract, you agreed you wouldn't do that. You get your stuff out, you keep it clean, or get it, get all your garbage out,
Yeah, I had a similar situation, and the buyers were like, well, we don't really have room for it with our furniture. They said it in a nice way. Yeah. And that at that point, the seller's agent, thank goodness I had an agent. Mm-hmm. He stepped in and was like, I can come get that. I can move that. Don't worry, I'll come by. He made an appointment with them to come by and remove it for the sellers, because I think he knew that they should have taken care of it. He didn't want the, deal to go sour. Just because the sellers didn't feel like moving a piece of
I don't envy
furniture.
Agents that are in that position, because I've seen that quite a bit too, of agents are like, oh, I'll grab that. It's not their job. It's not their responsibility. It's not part of their deal, but they do so to try to make things right.
Yes.
Because try as we might, our clients don't always listen to us.
Yeah.
Our Huntersville office was the benefactor of a situation like that, where an agent had an elderly client who didn't take some furniture out. One, because, thinking that the buyer might want it or whatever. The buyer didn't. The buyer's sticking to this. No, you got to get it out. So the agent handled it and was like, hey, does anybody need a desk?
Right.
And we were like, we'll take it. So
start a whole forum of,
occasionally,
furniture, abandoned furniture.
It worked out for us in that instance.
Yeah.
But, that agent, we were like, I hope your seller really appreciates that you did this for them, because you're keeping them from being in, having a problem with their buyer, and you're going above and beyond what you're required to do. So
I will say we have some good agents, both on the buyer side and seller side. I had one closing this week where her agent, it was I think it was an estate. And so an elderly heir, was having to move all the stuff out of the house, and there was a whole attic full of stuff. So the agent had her team go and help at least get stuff down from the attic. Yeah. Went that extra step to do that. Yeah. And I thought that was super cool.
That is. And it's also like, man, y'all do a lot of running around, and you have to keep juggle a lot of things. And then to take those additional things on, I hope your clients appreciate you for it. They should. Now, next thing, there's a note here in a box that says buyer's failure to conduct a survey or examine title of the property prior to the expiration of due diligence period does not relieve the seller of their obligation to deliver good title under this paragraph. And I wanted to bring this up for a couple reasons, but a big one being, if the surveyor can't get out until the day before closing, or the survey isn't returned until the day before closing, and there's a title issue discovered, seller's still got to fix it.
We've had a few of those.
Yes. And especially with, there's not a ton of surveyors to go around. They're busy.
I will say you must book, if you're intending to have a survey done, and it's part of your deal, you need to book it at least a month, 2 months in advance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So keep that in mind with due diligence and earnest money. If you don't have a current survey and whoever's forking out the money, make sure you put that into your timeline or have a contingency based off that survey. Yeah.
And the other side of that too, for buyers, sometimes they'll be like, well, the survey, we decided not to get the survey because it wouldn't come back before the due diligence period expired. Well, if it would come back before closing, the seller would still be required to remedy any title defects discovered by that survey. So don't let that alone.
Right.
Schedule it ahead of time. But title issues, the date for that is closing, not the due diligence date. And the other thing is that's even to title exam. Now, we take the position that we want to examine title as early as possible so that we can discover things that and work on things, getting payoffs, et cetera, with as much lead time as possible. But let's say, we only had 3 days notice to do a closing, which is probably not going to happen. But we only had 3 days notice to do a closing and due diligence had already expired, and we run the title search and there's a problem, seller's still got to fix it. So there's no requirement in the contract that survey, title exam, et cetera, be completed before the due diligence period. It doesn't alleviate the seller's obligation to fix it just because that due diligence period has expired.
Right. Survey can still be late to the game, but it still you have to fix the issues on that one piece of important piece of information.
Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is negotiated repairs and improvements on page 11 of the contract. It is section
N,
yeah. Under what number? 8. 8N. So if a seller negotiates to complete repairs or improvements, which they don't have to do, we went into that in detail on the buyer's side of things, letting them know, like, hey, if your seller says no, they say no. So sellers can say no. But if you do agree to do that, the buyer has the right to come back and verify that you did that. Not just that it's done, but that it's done in a good and workmanlike manner. You've probably seen instances where a seller says they'll fix something, but they fix it themselves and they don't know how.
Yes.
And
there's a special word for that, but I'm not going to say it out loud. Yes. The buyer is entitled to come and see if it works properly or if it does not. If it still doesn't, work properly or it's up to code or standard or I don't know buyer standard, they want you to fix it.
It doesn't have to be perfect, but that good and workmanlike manner, it's what lawyers call a term of art. It has a meaning that by lawyers looking at the words good and workmanlike manner, there are cases that talk about what that means. So it's not subjective, or it is subjective to an extent, but it's not I thought it was good enough. And the buyer's like, well, it's trash. There's a happy medium.
There has to be, you have to reach a level of workmanship completed to qualify for it to be, said and done.
Yeah. Like if the window is cracked and you duct tape it and you call it a fix.
Right.
That's not going to fly.
Right.
But it's also about that access that the buyer can come back and verify it prior to settlement. And settlement, I mentioned this in the buyer's episode, settlement is the signing. That's not, that's not even prior to closing. They don't even have to show up and sign until they've been able to verify those things. So as a seller, don't refuse to let your buyer back in.
That is one of the questions, in my table conversation, did you do your final walkthrough? Are you satisfied? Is there anything that we need to know? Is there any
reason why we should not be doing this step?
Right. Are there any questions, any concerns, comments, concerns? Because if there are, then, it's representing the buyer. It's our job to make sure we get those taken care of before we start signing. Because after you're done and signed, you're taking it as is.
And unfortunately, it's that question that it's a love-hate. we want to ask it because we represent the buyers and it's our
job.
We want to, but then it's also like, as soon as they say, well, we know, okay, this one's probably not going to record today. And that's fine because it's got to be right. It's, the terms of the contract have to be fulfilled, but it can sometimes mess with the expectations of the parties of them thinking, oh, I'm moving in today.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not.
Maybe.
maybe not. Charges by owners association, number 9. This one I think is a big one for sellers. They don't understand why they have to pay the HOA something for selling. They're like, I'm not paying that. Well, the contract says you will. You signed a contract saying that you would pay for certain things due to the HOA. So anything that that the HOA does to confirm that you've paid, that if there are any assessments, and that includes any expedite fee in connection with providing it, any fees that are for the sake of transferring or updating the ownership records of the association. These could be multiple fees, unfortunately.
Yes.
And I lovingly call them the breakup fee at closing.
That's a good term. I'm going to use that.
Yeah. And I always tell the buyers too, don't worry, when you sell, you're paying it too. Unless all this changes by then.
Yes.
You should expect you're paying the breakup fee when you leave.
Yes.
And, sellers are like, why? And they're like, well, they don't want the cost of you leaving to be borne by the people that are staying.
Yeah.
But, there's all kinds of discussions about, well, aren't these egregious? How much does it really cost to transfer the ownership? I will politely decline to comment on that stuff.
HOAs are a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows it, but they serve a purpose, but they're not free. And pretty much anything you do, changing something with the property with HOA is going to be there's going to be a fee to do that because people don't work for free. But if you have a boat slip or if you have a dock fee, some sellers they forget that on top of your main HOA, you're going to have to transfer all that, or there's going to be a fee to, get everything up to date on the new buyer side.
Or we upgraded the pool this year, so all the owners are paying a little extra or whatever it may be.
Right.
Well, guess what? You agreed to pay for that at your HOA meeting or whatever. There were the votes. So
right. You may not have agreed to it, but you were at least
enough people did.
Notified, or you knew it was coming down the pipe.
Yeah. And another thing for listing agents, if you've got a seller that feels really strongly they don't want to pay some of these fees, it's really either side, but this stuff is negotiable, but it has to be in writing. So a seller saying at the table, I'm not paying that. Sorry.
That wasn't negotiated.
And our job as the closing attorney is to carry out the terms of the contract, and you either pay it or I guess you're not closing and you can breach the contract.
Right.
But this says you're going to pay it. So that's how we're going to have it on
down. This is the only writing we have referring to that. So it's going to have to go one way or the other, and it's going to be a real hassle to go the other way if you don't want to continue on.
Yeah. And then the next paragraph, prorations and adjustments. The thing I wanted to point out to sellers here is that sellers are responsible for the prorated amounts of any taxes and dues through the date of settlement. If there's any prorated rents, then they're also entitled to the prorated rents through the date of settlement. So that can sometimes be a question of, well, why do I have to pay for today? They're going to own it by the end of the day because the contract that you signed says you'd pay through the date of settlement.
Right.
So, for example, people closing the day we're recording this, January 19th, then you'd be responsible for the taxes through January 19th.
Right. We don't prorate the days.
Yeah, we're not cutting the day in half.
There's nothing at 12 p.m., 2 p.m. You have the full day.
Yes.
So, and coming back to the day and time, make sure you do realize that your due diligence and everything, it's usually a 5 p.m. cutoff.
Yes.
At that day and time.
Yes.
Not midnight.
Yes. And you're not going to believe this, but I have agents ask me, what time zone? Like, well, the contract says in the state of North Carolina. So it's going to be the time, 5 p.m. in North Carolina.
Right.
Like,
let's
our
put it where
buyers are in California.
The property time, property's time zone.
Yes. And the contract says that. But they're looking for ways to buy their buyers more time. They're like, well, they're in California, so we get more. No, you don't. It's
you got to get up early that day.
Here. Now, on the topic of prorations, this can be a hot topic at the closing table. I've personally been yelled at by a lot of, I'm not trying to pick on old men. It's been old men that have yelled at me, and that's pretty much it. If there were other people that had yelled at me, I'd say that, but it's old men that yell at me about the tax proration because they believe that the taxes are prorated on a fiscal year basis, but that is not true. There's a North Carolina statute that says that taxes are to be prorated on a calendar year basis unless otherwise agreed in writing. And the contract itself, the writing between the parties, says prorated on a calendar year basis. So regardless of what period the county may run their financial calendar on.
Right.
Doesn't matter what the county's budgets run on. The lien on the real property relates back to the first of the calendar year. So it's going to be prorated on the calendar year basis. Again, if you don't like it, amend the contract.
Speaking of old men, this is just for the elderly population in general. So North Carolina does the senior discount on taxes, on property taxes for your primary residence. And I've had a lot of questions because the new tax bill or the taxes that you're paying into will not be based off of that senior discount because
it doesn't carry over.
The new buyers are not the same age bracket, or not usually. They can be, and at that point, go down to the county and get that senior discount as well. But you pay for the regular tax bill that comes through that's due, or you pay into the proration where that new tax bill is going to be the regular amount.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think people are hoping, oh, well, the tax bill is this now. Well, it's not going to be when you buy. Condition of the property at settlement. This is paragraph 11. The property's got to be substantially the same or better condition. So I think that one's probably pretty self-explanatory. But, some sellers will think, something bad happens to the property and they're just like, oh, well, I'm not paying money to fix that. I'm just going to let it become the buyer's problem. Fortunately not. Whatever condition the property was in when you went under contract, it's got to be the same or better. Next thing, delay in settlement or closing. We talked a lot about this. If you've listened to the buyer's side of this, then this will be familiar to you. But this 7 days to delay is only available if one party's ready, willing, and able to complete the settlement, and the other party, it is not possible for them. Now, Megan, you gave a good example of something that feels like it's an impossibility, but unfortunately probably isn't, about the new construction. Will you relay that again for those that probably maybe didn't hear the other episode?
Yeah, of course. So this came across my table at one point in time where our buyer was delayed because the seller wasn't ready to move out because they were purchasing a new construction. And with new construction, you most likely will have a delay or two. And it had put them delayed on their schedule for moving out of the property they were selling. And they were saying that it was not possible for them to close because they couldn't move. Unfortunately, that's not an excuse.
Yeah.
There is a possibility for you to put your things in storage, move into an Airbnb or a hotel for a few days, might be a week, but you have made a promise. You sign a contract with the buyers that are buying your property. So unfortunately, you have to figure out where you're going to go in your limbo. That's not your buyer's limbo. That's your limbo for your other property.
Yeah, and it is unfortunate, and we're not saying that it's not a terrible situation, but what it is it is an inconvenience, and while it might be a major inconvenience, it is not an impossibility. And I think that's a really good example of one where it might not feel good.
Yeah.
But if the buyer's not willing to amend the closing date, then they could hold you to it.
Or the other option, if the buyers are not needing to move in right away, you can do a seller possession after closing. You can still close, and then agree
paying some rent to stay.
Right, you've got to pay. Update and amend the contract that gives you the right to stay there, but still close if the buyer is willing to. Sometimes they are also on a time constraint and need to get into the house. So it's just, again, communication, expectations.
Exactly. Now, on the other side of that, say you're a seller and you're ready. You're not the holdup, and the buyer says they can't close because they don't have the clear to close with their lender. Well, why don't they have the clear to close with their lender?
Right.
Have they not been providing answers and documents timely? Is their lender not being efficient or not diligently working on the file. We're lucky to work with some really great lenders, but not all lenders are created equally. So, people not progressing on the file diligently, again, not an impossibility. That unfortunately is just not the case. Now, I think one example of a buyer impossibility, whenever there was all the banking drama last year, where certain bank, was it Silicon Valley Bank? They couldn't send wires.
They were shutting down.
And they hadn't released the funds. Now, the Fed had agreed that, those people were going to be made whole, but that was a little bit out of the control. We had a buyer who banked with that bank and couldn't send money. And they had the funds, and the Fed had come out and said that those funds are going to be made available to the buyer. I think they had a good argument for impossibility because there was no way it could have been foreseen. It wasn't anything that they had done. They hadn't caused it, and it wasn't as if they could just pull money from somewhere else to do it. That one closed and they worked it out. So I don't know how that would shake out in front of a judge. That's how that would be decided.
Yeah.
But I think that's a pretty good argument for impossibility. Again, I'm glad we didn't have to find out.
I have a similar, so I'm listening to Sealy and one of another attorney in South Carolina. She was stating that back in 2008, when the whole market crashed, that everybody had signed everything, and they were just waiting on the lender wire to come through, and the lender wire never came through because that bank shut down,
Collapsed.
and it collapsed. So then it never went through. They could not. They had to.
Nothing you can do.
Nothing you can do. So they weren't in breach. And I don't know I think they just went and did a whole nother loan with a different bank.
Yeah.
But at that point, that is not a breach of contract.
Yeah. It's not a
Because
buyer's
that's
breach.
totally out of your hands.
Yeah.
Based off of the national economy.
That
But I
is
just thought that was
terrifying.
just mind blowing. But she was
a bank implodes in the middle of your deal.
She was harping on the fact that you can't disperse, you can't, give out keys, you can't record until you have all the funds, but then they never got all the funds because of the bank.
Yeah.
So just those things do happen.
Yeah. Thankfully not often. Oh my gosh. I hope we don't see that
again.
Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about on the seller side, there again, I'm going to qualify this by saying the stuff we're going over, this is not everything. This is, read the contract in entirety. Make sure your clients have read the contract. So, this is not, if you don't pay attention to anything else, you're good. No, these are the highlights that we see sellers get in trouble with. But the last one I want to call attention to is under possession. So possession shall be delivered upon closing. And as we talked about, closing ends upon the recording. Disbursement doesn't happen until after closing. And possession is due upon closing.
Yes.
So sometimes we'll have sellers say, I will give you the keys when I get my money. Well, you are not going to get your money before closing, and you owe them possession upon closing. So you see how we got a conflict there? So unfortunately, sellers, your obligation to deliver possession, which is every means of access, mailbox keys, garage door openers, security codes, fobs, pool stuff, all of that. You got to give that over upon closing. So you don't have to give it before. You don't have to give it at the table if you don't want to, if you're not comfortable. You can if you desire. That's your decision. But once that deed is recorded, you do have to deliver possession. And unfortunately, it very rarely works out that you are going to have your money instantaneously.
Right.
Now, maybe you work out that you come to you pick up a check, and while you pick up a check, you drop off the keys to the buyer. I mean, that could be something that you do, but especially if you get a wire, you're going to have to give up possession before you get money in your account.
Right. I mean, I think the main transaction, you either give the keys to your agent or the buyer's agent, because agents know they cannot release the keys until it's recorded, and that's the close of the transaction. or leave them with our office, and then the buyers can come back and pick them up. Because no seller wants to come back and drop off a key or get in contact or, have keys floating around.
At that point, you just want to get your money.
Yeah.
Move on. Well, I think that is, while we could talk about this for probably another 2 hours, maybe let's not do that and we can save it for another episode. But Megan, as always, I so appreciate you joining me on this episode and all the episodes you've been on. I think there's a lot of good nuggets in here. Hopefully you guys got some good information out of it, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you.